Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivan Stanky. I'm with Extraction Oil and Gas. I am the safety supervisor for them. And we're going to go over Oil and Gas 101. So please ask questions. Please ask any information that yourself or your peers might find useful. So as we look at oil and gas, we're in the Julesburg, Denver, Julesburg Basin. And in this basin, our wells have been active since the turn of the century. We have been producing oil and gas in this area since 1903. 1903 was the first well established in Boulder County. And we have been extracting hydrocarbons ever since. The different types of wells that we have are vertical, horizontal, and then we also have multi-well pads as well as midstream that we're going to be having a part of our operation. So the old legacy wells, they're the vertical wells that just go straight down and extract hydrocarbons that way. To minimize the footprint that we have in extracting the hydrocarbons, we have moved to what's called the horizontal program. And in the horizontal program, you'll see we actually put well bores horizontally in the formation to increase the density of the well bore in that formation. We also have some drilling, fracturing, and pipeline technology that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Big picture, we're worried about extraction oil and gas is our paramount concern is public safety and making sure what we're doing is correct for the environment, correct for the community relations, and for the people working in those. And we have advanced our technologies and resources to ensure that we can deliver that. So just some of the life cycles of the drilling operation. So as we talk about actually drilling a well, it's taken us in between 3 and 5 days to drill the well. Now you have to think if we have a multi-well pad, you have to multiply that by the number of wells per pad. So if the drilling rig is out there for a prolonged time, we're drilling multiple wells on that pad. But typically we can complete and drill a well in 3 to 6 days. And as we move into the completions, that would include the fracking and the mill-out segments of that. And then we move into the production phase. So depending on the size of the pad, the number of well bores that we have per unit is how long those operations will be corresponding to that. As we look at the well and the life cycle of the well, the picture on the top right-hand corner, that is the old vertical well style. Basically, we drilled straight down, and the small little footprint that we put into that zone, whether it's the Codell or Niobrara zone, that's what we could harvest. So the production and the return on investment isn't as much as what we can do on the horizontal component. As you can see in the horizontal program on the bottom picture, that will go down to that zone about 65 to 7,000 foot, and then we'll put a turn on the well bore and actually put the well string into that formation and increasing the amount of exposure to that zone and actually be able to harvest more hydrocarbons within that operation. The biggest advantage of this is the footprint that we're actually exposing on top of the surface. We can actually utilize and get a higher percentage of hydrocarbons extracted without the exposure and the disturbance to the footprint. Some of the drilling hazards, as we look at the drilling phases specifically, there's always the potential for fires. With the hydrocarbons, we have diesel fuel at times out on location, as well as pressurized fluids, rotating equipment, confined spaces, some electrical and corrosive materials. We have committed to operating our drilling rigs on highline power from the utility services. So we will have high voltage on locations, and that's what the rigs are operating on, is whether it's on highline or generator, they are an electrical driven system. Within drilling, it is manned 24 hours a day. The occupants from the drilling rig and other support agencies, they do live on site. So there'll be man camps on sites during the drilling operation. So as we have people out there, you have to consider not only the prime essential personnel for that operation, as well as their opposite in an emergency response. Within the hydraulic fracturing component, This is considered part of the completion phase. So we will have what's called the hydraulic fracturing or the fracking of the well, and this is where we go in and stimulate the well bore. So when we get done drilling, we have a solid piece of metal that goes all the way out to the toe that nothing can come back. There's actually no pressure on the well bore at that time. We'll go in and perforate the well in different segments, and as we perforate that, then we'll energize the well with fluids and sand, open up those spores, open up those pores, and actually pump at high pressure sand and fluid into the well bore. That'll take about 3 to 5 days per well to complete that. And once again, just with multiple well pads, you have to multiply that with per well bore. After that, we go into what's called the drill out phase. So as we go into segments into that well bore to be able to stimulate and frack it, we actually put plugs in components to isolate the area of the well bore that we're actually stimulating. So before we can flow that and get that into the production phase, we use a coil or other workover rig to go in and mill out those plugs to remove any of those isolation points that we have deposited in the well bore. That phase itself will take 1 to 2 days. And then finally, in the completion phase, we have what's called the flowback. And this is the initial well testing of the well. So we're actually getting some of that fluid that we used on the flowback or on the stimulation side. So there's a high concentration of water. We're using temporary equipment that has higher volumes to be able to harvest that water off, to separate it, and then get into the hydrocarbons once it's started to cut oil and gas. That can be up to 30 days. Sometimes it's actually lasted as short as 2 to 3 days. So each well has its own characteristics. So depending on the pressure, how much hydrocarbons there, they'll turn either quicker or slower.
So Ivan, just a question for you is, will there be actually storage sites during that phase on scene, on your site at that point in Broomfield, or are you guys?
Correct. So we are working on that, but there is a likelihood that we will have temporary storage tanks on the flowback side because it's actually safer for the flowback teams to be able to do so. So we'll have temporary fluid holding vessels there. They look like kind of that blue tank on the right-hand side, and those tanks are 500 barrel, and we talk everything in oil and gas in barrels, but 500 barrel vessels that we can store. So everything is times 42 gallons to get down to the gallon side. So it's 500 barrels times 42 to get to the gallons level. But ultimately, we can then look at, assess, and know how that well is responding before we get into the equipment. We really don't want to put that initial flowback fluid into our production facility because it can deteriorate it to a higher rate, and we don't build our facilities to that volume. If we built to that volume, we'd have to actually build a bigger facility that you would be exposed to and have to look at. So we use temporary equipment that can handle a higher volume for the short term, and then we stage that out after we're done with that. Any other questions to flowback, completion, stimulations? Normally, the fracking component usually gets the baddest or the most concern and most speculation on public appearance. It's truly one of those activities that we're using horsepower, what we call horsepower, but they're basically semi-trucks that are parked on a trailer that's put into a series to energize the ground. Within the completion phase, some of the components that will be out there will be high-pressured equipment. That high-pressure equipment, as I just mentioned, is just diesel-powered engines. We'll use compressed natural gas as well as the fuel source to minimize the exposure of that and transport of that. We also have what's called a blender, and that's where we're actually mixing sand with the fluid. So we use a blender and some other storage trucks. But once again, it's just like a semi-truck. It's just like anything that rolls up and down the road, whether it's a trash truck, cement truck, a bus, it's the same component with that. Very similar to any vehicle. We also will have chemicals on location to do that, or I'm actually using new components within our chemical portfolio to change what we'll have on your guys' sites, as well as sands and fuel storage. The living working quarters for the crews, during the completion phase, we actually don't have living quarters there. It'll just be the people that's working on pad. For the occupation of the frac and the completion phases, we work in 12-hour shifts, so they'll actually leave. So there'll be actually a little higher rate of traffic at those times, but we have never actually had people live on site in housing components during that operation. We'll also have water storage, equipment storage, vehicles, of course, and then other exposures. Any questions to completions? Some of the hazards associated with that, of course, we'll have pressurized fluid and gases. This is where we'll see our most extreme pressures during the frac phase. As the horsepower and the completions is going on, we'll go up to 6,500 to 7,000 PSI within those operations. So we have some exposure there. I would say that personal injury would be the greatest concern that. As you respond to any incident, majority of the time, that will be all bled off and isolated by the time any exposure would be there. Some corrosive fluids that we have been changing, radioactive materials. Sometimes we use what's called isotopes, and we just use that to find and to track signatures within the wellbore. So we'll have isotopes associated with that. We do have some rotating equipment, as mentioned, and then the confined spaces, some vapors, fired hazards, primarily associated with equipment and equipment exposure there. And then we do have silica dust as a result from using sand. We have been using an enclosed closed-loop system for the sand. Only one person on location actually has to use a respirator at this point, and that's only on a recommendation. It's not within the OSHA permissible exposure limits. So there would be a very low responder exposure to silica dust. Once again, works 24 hours a day. We will have a gate guard at the mouth of the entrance of these, and then, of course, sign in, and then we'll have signage supporting your direction throughout the pad as needed. As we transition into the production phase, so we've already completed the drilling, we've completed the completion phase, the mill out, the flow back, then it actually goes into the production phase. And this is where we're actually harvesting the oil and hydrocarbons. Every well that's produced in Colorado, in the United States, will produce a different mixture of oil, water, and natural gas. All three of those components are a result of flowing back a well, that specifically for hydrocarbons. So with that, it's our job as an E&P company, oil exploration and production company, to put those three different commodities into different avenues. And we use our production facility to do this. The outline that is here, the one change is the 6 larger tanks there will not be on a part of this facility that will be designed and engineered here in the Broomfield development. However, we included this on your orientation because the old legacy production facilities still have those there. So as it comes off, each wellhead will have its own flow lines. Basically, it's a pipe that will be underground that connects the wellhead to the facility. That flow line will connect to the separator. The separator will be the first place that we break out gas, water, and oil. Okay? So we have what's called a 3-stage separator. That first stage, the gas breaks off. The fluids will go into the lower chamber, and then that lower chamber will break off water and oil. Of the two fluids, which is heavier? Water is heavier. Water will go to the bottom of the vessel. Oil will resonate to the top. So we use that own specific gravity to separate those out. They'll go into a box in dumps and stuff and then go to its own vessel. Did everyone get that one right?
Sure. Educated guess. Officer Lopez got it right.
So from the separators, the water will go through lines to the production tanks. Those produced water tanks will store the water. The oil will go to what's called the VRT. The VRT is the vapor recovery tower, and that vapor recovery tower is another means of getting that last little bit of natural gas off the oil before it goes into the oil tanks. As an oil and gas company, as a producer in Colorado, we have been driven to capture all the natural gas off the oil that we can, because once it gets into the tanks, if you do not capture it in previous stages, it'll then vent off. So we're taking hydrocarbons from 300, 400, 1,000 PSI coming out of the wellbore, and then we're ultimately dropping it down to less than a pound. And as you drop it down in pressure each time, that gas will actually be naturally released. And as that gas is naturally released, we're trying to capture it so it doesn't go to the atmosphere. Once it gets to the tanks, all we can do is actually burn it off in our flare stacks or combustors. As we get to the combustors, we rather burn it. It gets to a less impactful gas as it's combust rather than the gas that comes off the tanks. So that's the purpose of those. We will always, to an extent, use our combustors. That's the purpose of those, is to make sure we minimize the exposure with that. Unfortunately, once it gets to the tanks, we cannot sell that because of the oxygen infusion of that. So ultimately, that tank headspace will have a component of gas and oxygen in there, and we can't put that down the cells line. So that's why we have to combust it versus just vent that off. Is there any questions to this flow design? As I mentioned, the tanks, we'll still have the wellheads, we'll have the separators, we'll have the vapor recovery towers, we'll also have the gas compressors. There's 3 different phases of gas compression that we'll have. We'll have low pressure, high pressure, and flash gas compressors that we utilize to push and move gases to the system. Any questions with those? All right. Production facilities. These are some pictures of production facilities on legacy sites, more common to what's on locations now throughout Broomfield from spot to spot. Ultimately, they do have tanks. Those tanks will have either oil and water in those. The picture on the top right is known as a heater treater. So that is a higher volume. It can handle higher volume gas and break off the fluids, more resonance times with that vessel. And then the bottom picture, you'll see some pictures of pits. Those pits are primarily put in the ground. They'll either have a condensate or water in those, and we put pits in the ground for insulation factors. That way the water won't freeze.
Is everybody comfortable that they're clear that the new production stuff won't have this on it? We're using pipelines to take that all away. So just wanted to make sure everybody was gathering that. It's the old ones that have this risk to
Correct.
us.
So no tanks.
Correct. Except that the first question I asked, that temporary, when they're in that part, they're going to have those temporary tanks. Yep.
And the drilling and the completion phases, we will have what's called sound walls around the operations. That sound walls is just to protect and keep the noise, the light from penetration into the communities. Ultimately, we do that as a courtesy, making sure that that noise that we're producing, whether from the drilling completion phases and or the lights that we use for the 24-hour operation, is as minimal impactful to the community as we can. With that, those operations are contained in there, but we're still doing drilling and completion operations. After we get...
Other than at the guard entrance, are there other entrances on the sound wall?
Yes, so within each sound wall we put exit points. We'll have a primary muster point, which will be the drive patterns in and out. Each facility will have an in and out exit point, but also on the perimeter of the sound walls we put what's basically exit points just for personal safety in case there is an incident. There will be those. So if the wind conditions warrant it, we might muster a different direction than to the primary muster point.
So far staff are looking for you guys at a muster point. It may not be primary muster point A might be on the outside of the sound wall at a different muster point.
Correct.
Okay.
Traditionally, if it allows, even if people exits and evacuates through those secondary or tertiary points, they're still going to move up towards the mouth of the entrance if it's safe for them to do so. Any other questions on evacuation? Some of the equipment that will be on locations, we do have the kind of, I would say, peach color on the left-hand side. That peach color is an example of tanks. As it was explained in the questions, these tanks will be on our new sites in Broomfield. These are storage vessels for both water and produced oil. And then, so that component won't be on new sites, but it is on legacy existing sites. As we move into the separator, that is an example of an older separator, but the separator is our primary tool to start that separation process of the 3 phases of the hydrocarbons. Those will be there. Once again, that's connected from the wellhead by a flow line, a metal pipe that is buried underground. From the separator, it'll go into a bulk separator. Basically, it'll be a vertical separator that's going to be included in just another residence time that we're going to use to minimize the amount of oil-water mixture and then be able to send it down the pipeline. These compressors illustrated there, we will be utilizing electric compression there. So within the electric compression, it is a quieter choice and option within the compression portfolio versus using basically a Cat engine. We're going to use an electric motor that's quieter, less emissions with that associated with the operations. Any questions on the components? And then the top right-hand corner, it's called kind of a VRT, Vapor Recovery Tower. Once again, that's just getting more gases off the fluids before we go into a oxygenated system. Some of the other components, VRT, we will have piping. As you notice, the piping, the one in the center in the green section, you'll notice that throughout Broomfield now. We have those risers. Those will be different pressured systems. Those risers are usually associated with midstream oil and primarily natural gas conveyance structures for the midstream. So they're there now. We'll also have chemical storage. From time to time, we'll use some chemicals to minimize freezes, some chemicals to minimize scaling and other things. The scenarios that we have set up for your operations will look a little different than that moving forward, but may be on some existing sites as well. To the bottom left-hand side, we'll have the wellheads. The far bottom left picture is a pump jack unit. Those pump jack units are utilized in a tailing off production cycle. So as the wells get into their 10th to 20th year, as there's very little pressure, formational pressure downhole, we'll utilize a pump jack to potentially lift the fluids because there's not enough flow from gas to be able to lift that fluid. Most commonly, the wellheads on the wellheads will be very similar to the center and right picture there for example of wellheads. The wellheads will have a tree on it. Basically, you'll have what's called a tubing connection. You'll have an annulus connection. But with that, for your information, you won't have to really go close to our wellheads. We'll also have burners and flares. They are designed to burn clear and efficient. With that, normally the biggest complaints that comes from a production facility is due to smoking, and smoking of our flares basically as we get sometimes what's called a wet gas. Our gas sometimes turns out to be a little wet. We'll get a little bit of a puff of black smoke from our flares. As long as that is corrected rather quickly, it's more of a public concern than anything with that. And then we'll also have generators from time to time as just an energy source. Most all generators will be small light plants at the point of source, perhaps at the guard shack is the only place we'll have to use temporary generators.
So, will there actually be any of the burners and flares in Brookfield?
Yes.
Like exposed
So
flame and so
so first of all, there will be ECDs, emission control devices, and those are the burners. So we call them internally an ECD. So they're an emission control device, and we use those for protection of the system. So if we have an upset condition and our compression goes down and we need to safely depressurize that system, we want to take that gas to the burner. So it is a safety device as well, and from time to time, within our system, yes, we'll have those.
Will there be any kind of notice given or anything if that is gonna flare, if there's gonna be a flame versus not? I guess what I'm thinking is I could just see the public,
Right.
whether it's wanting to cause a problem or whether they're truly scared,
Right.
saying it's on fire. You know,
Yeah.
we have some forewarning of that so that we'll be able to say it's no big deal, relax. This is responding.
So with that, our design will never have an open flame.
Okay.
So our flame systems within that tall stack to this tall stack here, the flame's down in here and the burner rail's right here, and the flame only goes up to about here. We put this taller stack for efficiency and then also to keep the flame out of public's eye.
Great.
So as I said, the only thing you'll see from time to time is possibly the smoke when we don't have a good mixture. And then we'll get that fixed really quickly, but you should never see an open flame as a concern. Some of the hazards with production facilities, there is a potential of fire. Of course, with any equipment, there's always that possibility of fire, and you introduce hydrocarbons. There is confined spaces from time to time. However, for the most part, we don't go in confined spaces. There's the underground pipelines, and the underground pipelines, the biggest hazard to a pipeline system is the riser systems and vehicle exposure to those pipelines. Pressurized equipment, vehicle traffic, some elevated falls, and then with an electrical system, there is that possibility of a shock hazard. So as we shift, we're going to shift. That was a quick overview of the production system, production operations. Is there any questions before we kind of leave that overview?
If you can just quickly go over your staffing by each phase, how many people, what hours, those type of things, so these guys know what to expect if they roll up.
Okay, so I'm even going to go before the drilling phase. So right now, the current operation, we're doing construction on civil work, on pads. We'll have periodic sand wall deployment. We'll have the pipeline operations. So those crews are 5 to 20 people. Right now, like on the interchange and other locations, access drive on the northwest, within those operations. Within drilling, for the drilling operations, we'll have 18 to 20 essential employees. And when I say essential employees, that's for that operation during that time. Then those 20 individuals will have opposites that will be on their off shift.
Is that 24 hours?
And that will be 24 hours. So up to 40 guys, but you have 20 guys that are either supporting the drilling operations or auxiliary support, or then you'll have 20 guys that are resting. Yes, sir.
Drilling is not scheduled to start until like after June now, right? So is it all of the activity is
April is
The first one.
the first one?
The pads are staggered, but April is the first one. I believe that is interchange
Right.
that we're
B.
aiming for.
Yeah, interchange B is the first pad we're going to drill.
Okay. No, I just read something that I thought it was in the Enterprise that with the lawsuit.
They're just dealing with the Livingston pad.
Oh, that's the
Now,
Livingston.
yes.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. I thought it was interchange.
No.
All right.
The interchange pad is off Huron.
Right.
The northwest pad is A and B is between Huron and Sheridan. And then the Livingston is off of Lowell. And then we'll have a United pad off of 160th to give you a proximity of those. Okay. So each one is kind of their own phases, and we're going to start on the Livingston, and then depending on permitting and access, we'll move throughout the rest of the pads. During the completions, actually the completions will have more. We'll have up to 40 people for the 24-hour shift. Each shift, basically, as the relief crew shows up, they'll have a handoff for 10 to 15 minutes, and then the day or night shift will leave. So for operational sakes, you can think about 35 to 40 people is what you have to account for during the completions operations. And then during production, depending on what we have for support crews, the primary production will be 2 to 5 people. And then we'll have different auxiliary crews either supporting or working on compression, do what's called roustabouting or just general crews, providing some service out there. So once we get into that production phase, there's some auxiliary support, but primarily 2 to 3 people will be supporting that. And we'll be monitored that 24 hours a day. One thing to add in with that, once we go into the production phase, whether there is someone there or not, we have the ability to ESD or have an emergency shutdown from anywhere remotely. So we can access our facilities remotely through telecommunication. So we do have that ability to shut in the wells, isolate the flow, and allow that to happen.
Then I would just one more, talk a little bit about the company man. That's
Thank you.
in charge. Yeah.
So as we go through our operational phases, we normally use consultants and company men to help facilitate operations from drilling to completions into the production. We'll use what's called the company man. For us, the company man will be in charge of that site, and they're basically the on-site boss of that facility or that operation. So as we have an emergency, please seek the company man, and if there is a need to establish unified command, we will have the company man establish that with you, and then with other responding departments, and then extraction employees will take that over from that time, after that point if it's warranted. But your initial contact should be through the company man, and that company man will give you directions of if there is injured personnel, what the threats are, what the status of well control if that is a concern.
So the company man is the contract company, not
Yes.
just one
If you,
person.
yes. So that's more of a term and not necessarily a person.
It's like the boss.
Yes. Yes.
So if you need, use that term, and they'll get you the right guy that you
Yes.
need to deal with.
Yep.
Does that person change for each different cycle?
Yes, it does. And that's why we try to keep that terminology open, the company man. So we'll have a company man for the drilling phase, and then we'll have a company man for the completion phase. The company man for the drilling phase lives on site, and he'll be there for 14-day shifts. So they show up, they're basically on call for 24 hours a day for 14 days. And then as we transition into the completion phase, those guys, because of the demand, basically alternate, and you'll have a company man that's there for 12, and they'll hand it off to another company man. But if you just ask for the company man, he's the guy in charge for that job in that interim phase. And even as you transition into the production phase and you ask for the company man, the extraction operator will step forward as that person, say, I'm the operator, I'm the person you need to interact with. For the most part, during the completions, for the drilling phases, your support primarily will probably be from the gate guard back. Perhaps on the production phases, you might need to support more so internally, but for the most part, I would expect on the initial phases of drilling completions, it would be more of an external support for our operations. As a first responder, whether it's accident response, we do have the potential for spills with any vehicles releases, and then the fire and explosion, and probably most common would be employee or personnel injury associated with that. Some of the management considerations, of course, is vandalism, theft, harassment, terrorisms. I'm sure we'll have some requests for support on protesters. We have everything properly signed, no trespassing, just for personal safety. We don't want any protesters impeding onto our properties just for their personal safety and awareness associated with our activities. Of course, public safety, one of the biggest concerns, any suspicious vehicles. The one thing within extraction, we do not have any company vehicles. So you'll never find a company vehicle that says extraction oil and gas on the side. We all utilize our personal vehicles. So that is one of the challenges within our operations. We don't have a white pickup or a pickup that has a specific label on the side of it. We'll use up to, each of these phases will use up to 15 to 30 vendors to provide different resources and services. So you might find different vendor trucks coming in, but one acknowledgement is during events, we'll have different layers of support entities trying to access the location. Possible task, of course, is to control traffic, escort responders into the location, facilitate the incident command structure, enforce evacuation orders, crowd control, security, and that security, sometimes as a responding entity, can be an advantage, and sometimes it can be a disadvantage. And it's going to be our job to work with your crowd control and security control to get our vendors inside that facility. Some of the points, of course, we do utilize the NIMS and ICS structure. We have had a couple successful tabletop drills with your team, with the North Metro Fire Department as well, and we do utilize the ICS structure. We do support and encourage unifying command with that, and knowing that we will never command your patrol and we'll never have direct control of any of the police or fire services, but we just want to be there as an information liaison, give you as much information about our operations, the potential risks, potential threats, and be able to be that first person to give you that valuable information. So that's why it's important to find the company man and or operator on scene. All locations, just because of what will be on the location, will be treated as a hazmat incident, and then all process equipment will be considered active and a possible threat until it's verified by an extraction employee. And then the well control incidents. Well control, that's the one question to always keep in your mind. Is the well control or the well and or gas or pressure associated with the well in a controlled fashion. Utilize the ICS unified command. The operator, as we said, the incident, whether it's big or small, we want to make sure we're giving you as much information to be successful. We don't expect you to be the oil and gas experts, but we expect you to be your experts and the experts in the services that you can provide us in being enforcement. With that, we'll try to give you as much information and use as non-industry specific terms as we can. With that, share that, understand priorities, have a single set of incident objectives, and ultimately stand down that, and then we can move on to our phases of cleanup or whatever is need to be due, and then minimizes the duplication of efforts. And that's one thing I have found and been relayed to me several times, that as a third party, we can mobilize resources extremely quickly. And we have a a large portfolio of vendors that can provide resources very timely and very quickly. And remember that we can get those resources there pretty quickly. And to be able to mobilize that, we need to work with you to be able to find the proper ways to get them in through traffic control and roadblocks.
With something like that, incident, is that something we would talk to the company man, have like a radio? Like how would we communicate? Is this all on phone?
It will likely occur out of incident command.
Okay.
So getting their equipment in, whether it's for spills or fire control or anything like that, that's why their company man will be part of that unified command. All of that will be orchestrated through the police incident commander, and then it will go through a traffic supervisor. They will be given a route that they can ingress in, and that will all be disseminated to our staff that will be working in incident.
So what happens if it happens like 3 in the morning? I don't have traffic.
3 in the morning, we're all coming out.
Okay. All right. Until then, though, how do I communicate?
Until then, we'll beat their equipment. Let's put it that way. So your police response as far as supervision and beginning that coordination with fire will happen quicker than their equipment will get there. But just know that they have specialized equipment for those type of incidences that will need assistance in, and that's going to be our job.
And we have, for that 3 o'clock instance, we have checklists that we're developing that you guys can pull out and get you headed in,
Like,
right? We're gonna cover
cool.
that.
If we have I'll take a copy of that.
Just take us that helps, right? The fire extinguisher will help.
This,
That's preferred.
okay.
Don't encourage him, Ivan.
I do have a serious question, actually. So when something does happen, are you guys looking at hours, days to fix that problem? I mean, how quick does that usually take if an incident does happen?
So
I guess it depends on the incident. Right?
depends
Yeah.
extremely on the incident. If it is a well-controlled incident, that event could potentially extend out to 3 to, if we have to call wild well control, they usually tell their clients expect a 3 to 10 day fix to the problem. In our experience, all of our events are usually much quickly resolved. For the most part, I would expect a 1 to 6 hour event at most. But there, I mean, it can extend, if we have to call well control experts, they expect a 3 to 7 day kill. And that's why the importance of incident command and making sure that we can get those objectives identified and command structures. If it is a 3 to 7 day event, then that's when we have to evacuate and have those type of resources. Most of the events most likely would be shelter in place type events for the community.
Are those experts coming from locally? Are they out of state? Or?
So we contract with Wild Well. They're our preferred vendor. They are located in Houston, Texas. They do utilize a private charter to mobilize their fire experts into locations. Wild Well does have a fire package in Greeley, Colorado. So by the time that fire package gets deployed from Greeley and is trucked down, most likely the respondent agents from Wild Well would be very closely arriving from there. The one unique thing about Wild Well, if they're working, they only work during daylight hours. They will not fight a well control scenario during night operations.
So when you're saying they have a package, is that like they've got their equipment is in Greeley?
Yes, sir.
A lot of it, and then their personnel are coming in from Houston, and so they sort of.
Yep.
And that's pretty new, Scott, that they used to fly in their equipment and their people.
Used to truck it in.
Yeah.
So they would truck it in. It'd be like a 12 to 18 hour deployment for the equipment if you need their specific well control equipment. Basically, it's two big Cat engine pumps with a monitor and some other support equipment.
And keep in mind also the way that we worked on this for the last couple of years, I can't talk more than I can, is you get that initial incident call, you activate incident command, North Metro is also gonna be out there on scene immediately, activated, because they're getting the same training, they've been involved in all the same scenarios. So you're not gonna be going alone, you'll be going alone initially. But as soon as North Metro activates their incident command, that brings in unified command, then you've got all the resources you'd ever want available.
Hopefully the follow-up piece that I do in just a second will make Vince a lot more comfortable.
I'm gonna need your phone number, Commander.
You have my
Yeah.
phone.
So one thing to put you guys a little bit at ease, I hope, is we have a railroad that runs through this city every day that carries stuff that is just as impactful. You guys know what your role is on that, right? Train derailment, same thing here, right? You find that engineer on the train, you find the company man, you start figuring out what it is that you have, and you start setting up and doing your things. So hazmat's hazmat. This one is just something because it's set, we can do more detailed plans to it. We don't know where the train's going to derail. We know where these places are.
And probably with an event status, probably the biggest concern we'll have is people trying to figure out what's going on. And just the unknown, and it's like, oh, there's police officers at the road. Let's go check that out. I'm sure you're associated and haven't been exposed and experienced in that. So that'll be probably the biggest thing, especially with the proximity of our well pads. You have I-25, and you have Northwest Parkway that's adjacent to our initial development. So there'll be a lot of what I call looky-loos, I'm sure. Ultimately, our goal with ICS is the best resource utilization, making sure we're using that as real time as we can and making sure we have that available. For many of these operations, we'll have millions of gallons of water readily available on site, as well as we'll have hydrants closely approximated to the pads per your guys' request. So we have put more due diligence on the front side of this operation than we have any other operation. Treat all equipment processes are they're active, hazardous, check facility signage. This is an example of one of the E&P companies in Colorado. It has all the pertinent contact information. With this, probably for the first, I would say close to 10 years of this program, I'm guessing someone will be on site 24/7, if not more. So there'll be people on site prior to your arrival with that. Perhaps once we get into lower production, it might taper off and we might have unmanned operations, but it's going to be a long ways down the road. Evacuation versus shelter in place. This will be a determination from incident command on multiple variables, whether it's on well control, citizen exposure, possible hazards and threats. So with that, we will go through the procedures protocol that the emergency management team has put together for whether it's for shelter or anything like that.
I'll go ahead and take over.
Okay.
Vince, you want to come up and help? Oh, negative. Sure. So essentially, did everyone get the impression that if it's an explosion, a fire, or a spill, it's primarily a fire department call? Okay? So that essentially means our job will be support. So just like Commander Laughlin said, on those type of calls, fire is getting dispatched and will arrive in some instances at the same time or before us, okay? If you haven't picked up yet, one of the most important things to recognize on all of those is it is a hazmat call. We do not send you guys into a hazmat scene. Your job is to stay distant. Your job is to assess certain things and report them. And even if you see injuries within that perimeter, you don't go in. That is fire department's job, okay? So our job will be support. And as you'll see, the primary functions of that support will be perimeter, will be security, will be traffic, and will be evacuation if necessary, okay? Does that kind of relieve you a bit? The guys with the suits, with at least the fire suits and the red trucks are the ones going in and doing all the work along with the oil personnel, okay?
So we'll talk a little bit further down about evacuation or shelter in place, but the one thing that I want you to know is that will generally arise out of a recommendation from the fire department. We won't typically make that determination unless you see when you arrive you need to order people out of that area. That you will cover. Getting further down as to whether or not we would either shelter in place or evacuate any businesses or any neighborhoods, that determination will be coming from fire. They'll make the recommendation that it needs to be 1,000 feet or a half mile or a mile. And at that point, that's when Incident Command makes the determination of how we're going to do that. That is worked in coordination with the police incident commander that's on scene, with likely the emergency manager if we stand up the EOC. If any of these things are long lasting, and by that I mean even more than a couple hours, if they are that serious, you can expect Incident Command is going to activate and the EOC is going to be activated. They will lead the response. For this class, most of this will be directed toward line level officer response. You will fill a role in one of those 4 pieces: the security, the perimeter, the evacuation, or the traffic pull. Does that kind of answer question? Okay. So at least for the MPOs in the room and the sergeants, you guys will get additional training as to the role you would play as part of that incident command structure. Oop, I went the wrong direction, didn't I? So essentially, just like it says here, site security is pretty much already established. If you were responding to any one of those incidences that could be determined as hazmat, you're not going to get that close. Matter of fact, in a lot of cases, you're not going to leave asphalt. And these pads are well onto dirt roads and off-site for those that haven't seen that. So your job when you immediately respond as a primary officer will be to call out what you see, to talk about what the weather conditions are, and to make immediate recommendations to your supervisor as to what you're seeing and what you think immediately needs to happen. Because there's a huge difference between somebody who just broke their arm on the scene and they need medical assistance and help getting an ambulance in versus you're seeing flames or you're hearing an explosion. But you guys have to take care of yourselves first. You don't get that close. Fire can take care of all of that, okay? So public safety concerns will drive a lot of this. That will be primarily our responsibility. Fire will work on the site to take care of what they need to take care of. We will deal with that as far as security, traffic, and evacuation. The traffic enforcement piece we've already talked about. Crime prevention is separate from what we're talking about with fires and explosions and things. If we get vandalism up there, you can handle that like a typical vandalism call. You've all done this. If you have a theft or anything like that, or even protesters, that will all be covered in a different format. But it'll be handled pretty standardly, okay? Oop, keep going the wrong direction. Any questions so far? I'm just going to get into what the preparations have been made by the police department. So essentially, this is the supervisor checklist when responding to an incident. So this is Vince Lopez. You're the acting supervisor. You're in car 1 or 2. You're going to have a packet that leads with this. We expect that the supervisors will be familiar with this ahead of time. It's broken into a number of sections which talk about that initial response. Ensure that North Metro is responding if it sounds like that type of event, right? When we show up, if we need to contact somebody on scene, who's that one guy that we contact? The company man, right? Okay. So going through that, contacting employees and reporting initial observations, the weather conditions, what you see, explosions, smoke, all that type of stuff is very helpful to that sergeant to know whether or not they need to activate more personnel. Does that all make sense? That's very standard for us, right? If it becomes an ongoing event, which means it's not a one-off, which means it's not a smoke flare or anything like that, but there is an active situation, our job is to peel back, and who's going in? Fire department, right? Okay. So at that point, we would expect a supervisor to show up and start doing activations. If it looks like it's going to last longer than a few minutes, they probably are contacting command. Command is responding. They're going to pair up with fire. At that point, they probably are also pairing up with the company man, and they have some type of unified command. Okay? Again, even though it's unified, our role is going to be support. All right? So the supervisor would typically go through all of these things, establishing a command post, identify staging, what are the exposure risks, all those type of things. Okay? Even if you guys are involved in any of these situations, you need to understand, even if you're 1,000 feet away and you're on a traffic assignment, we have the ability to monitor what your exposure is. We are thinking about that and calculating that into what your work cycle would be. Because I don't want to keep anybody within a certain perimeter and expose you to danger. The same thing could likely occur even in the case of an evacuation. I can't send a police officer in without any type of SCBA or equipment to evacuate somebody if it's dangerous to you guys. Sergeants and commanders working with fire and public health are going to be thinking about all of that. If it continues to go on, it's got the command notifications and consider activating the EOC. Additionally, that's when you would likely activate the traffic part. So we will probably rely on the patrol sergeant to set up an initial perimeter. Probably some cinch points on traffic. But at some point, once that becomes elevated, that's going to be transferred over to a traffic supervisor. Could be the traffic commander, could be a traffic sergeant, but that is not going to be patrol anymore, right? They would also consider whether or not social media advisements would be helpful, depending on when this could occur, whether or not there's exposure or an impact to the schools, all the way down to assistance from streets. We utilize that all the time. And then, just like Jesse mentioned, what is the ingress plan for equipment? Because we want to get the people with the right equipment to deal with the incident right on in as quickly as possible. Beyond that, then we have to decide the yellow section as far as the evac or shelter piece. Again, that's not on us. That's going to be advised by fire. They're going to talk about how big of an area, and they're going to talk about whether or not they feel it's safe that they shelter in place or they evac. Okay? Our job will be, once we get that information, to activate that. Typically, that's not going to be patrol again. Patrol may play a role in that, but we're going to bring in support personnel. That's likely going to be investigations. It could be civil. It's going to be bigger than us. Because you can imagine evacuating any type of neighborhood with any type of efficiency is going to take a lot of people. Any questions so far? Okay. And then you get down to, obviously, the PIO. We won't rely on the primary PIO being police. It's typically going to defer to fire, just like we would if it was an apartment fire or a big hazmat spill. It all goes fire. That kind of makes sense? Does that kind of help you kind of figure out what your role is in the whole thing, even at 2 o'clock in the morning? Okay. Quick overview, but this is the checklist that's available to that first line supervisor. Moving past that, there's 2 other checklists that you're going to see. One is that evacuation checklist. So if this gets that big and we're going to do an actual evacuation of an area, this is where that commander in charge of the evacuation with their sergeants and personnel will rely on this. What we wanted to accomplish with this is talk about a lot of the things that is going to be difficult to determine in the heat of the moment. Special considerations, all the way from if it's over in a certain area, whether or not there's a home for disabled youth there that will need special assistance to evacuate.
So these would be site-specific?
Site-specific, absolutely. Those type of things we want to try to predetermine as much as possible because thinking about them on the fly, very difficult. School exposure, all those type of things. Traffic plan to assist with that, and then reentry. The most important consideration will be getting information out to the public as to what that plan is. Because if we can't get them to help us evacuate a certain area, find a shelter, it's going to be very difficult if they're working against us. That makes sense? Okay. This is an example of the maps that would go along with like the Livingston plan. So if you can see, you've got Livingston right in the middle, and then you've got the circles that pan out from that. What we tried to do was model what we expect fire to give us as a determination of zones. So they figured out 1,000 feet, half mile, and mile typically would be their recommendation. And then within those, whether or not shelter in place is appropriate or evac. So we want those maps ahead of time so our supervisors work in this area have a clear idea visually as to what that looks like. And you'll even see if some of the traffic patterns are already pre-established to try to take the guesswork out of that. But again, these are recommendations because everything will be dynamic. It will not go the exact way that Kent and I planned. But if any of this helps make it flow faster for our supervisors, that's what we tried to do, was do a lot of the thinking on the front end. Any questions about that real quick? Evac distances, again, there will be maps that kind of express that. There will also possibly be some of those maps that we can do actually dynamically on New World, overlaying our F7. So you'll know also there real quick within an incident what maybe some of the information we want to pass on as far as zones or evacuation areas. Evac routes will have maps predetermined for that. You can see areas where there's road closures, areas where there's traffic control. All of this has been predetermined by our traffic supervisors. They've gone through by area and figured out what they would recommend as best case scenario to get people out. And then additional evacuation information. This right here are those posts, right, Scott?
Yes.
That we would expect, and how many people we might need, or whether or not it could be utilized through barricades, that type of thing. All of that will be predetermined with recommendations. This real quick is just a slideshow that is already available to the public. I just want to go through it very quickly so you have an idea of what they're going to see. Everybody in here have any idea what a code red is? Okay, reverse 911 essentially. Okay, that's an option for us to utilize as well. So they can go ahead and watch all of this online. It gives them a very simple summary of kind of what we've covered today, all the way through fire, explosion, and so on. What to expect from us when it happens. They have the ability to see this ahead of time to know we are going to tell them exactly what the evacuation route is, where to go, what the shelter in place means, and so on. What a code red is, how to register for that so they make sure they get the phone call. What to do, what shelter in place actually means. Not walk out into the backyard, look over the back fence and watch it, right? And then they also have some ideas as to some of the maps and areas as well. Some of the predetermined locations that could be utilized as shelters. Obviously, Paul Dirta would be one of them. There's the rec center up north in Anthem.
Yeah.
Potentially.
We're hesitant to use because double evacuation is always a bad thing.
Also, where they could likely get information as quickly as possible. Facebook, Twitter, and so on. Any questions about that? Kind of covered it. The MPOs will get more.
I'll say, yeah.
You get a lot more.
Like our part, like the law enforcement's on the like infiltration, sabotage, everything on more like that.
And that will happen separately as well. So what we're going to do is we're initially going to do training for our supervisors how they would handle the high risk stuff, which is your fire, explosion, and so on. Then we will also talk about the First Amendment issues, talk about how we would handle protesters, that type of thing. And then separately, I was originally thinking we would need some discussion about how we would handle crimes that occur, criminal mischief and so on. To be honest with you, I think most of that would not change. But you will get a specific procedure on how we would handle noise and odor investigations, because you know those will come in at all times. And we're going to try to keep that as simple and streamlined as possible. The one thing to keep in mind, I'll just defer real quick, is the gas and everything that comes out of these, does it have any odor?
All right, yeah, so the
Okay.
gas, the natural gas is non-odorized. So it'll have a kind of a hydrocarbon smell to it, like a gasoline or something like that, but it won't be like the mercaptan that you find in a natural gas system.
So if we get a call of a natural gas smell, what can you pretty much automatically assume? It's not this, right? Okay. Any questions as just a quick overview from the officer level as to the preparations that we've made to handle these? Okay. All right. Then I think we're done.
Thank you, Ivan. Oh,
Quick question that popped up. So our gate guards, so we will have gate guards at the mouth of the entrance on each of the facilities. The gate guards will have a ability to talk to our company man. They'll have the ability to have a radio with them, as well as they'll have head counts of who is on location. And then the traffic plans as approved by CCOB are very interesting. So that would be another component of that. Okay. As we get into the emergent scenario, that would be not as important, but understanding that to access our interchange pad, we're coming off of through the northwest driveway. So we're actually coming 1.5 miles away from the pad to access that location. So if there's an event there, there could be some people perhaps coming in on the lease road as well.
And to speak to the supervisors in the room, what you will get in your cars is you will have a binder that has these prompt sheets, that has these maps. Everything will already be there. The best thing that you can do, just like policy and everything else, is review those ahead of time before it happens. But it will all be there. We'll have large maps for you to work off of, as well as all of the response plans that are prompts. They're basically suggestions because nothing is set in stone. Nothing works exactly the way you write it in the comfort of the department. But hopefully it helps you guys kind of work through the incident.
And hopefully those of you guys that want to use will have it electronically for you if you choose that route to instead of your notebook. So
Sound good.
that works.
And at any time we welcome, if you guys want to come and look at the facility, coordinate that through me or Josh, and we'd be happy to facilitate that and be as proactive as possible.
How many acts of like sabotage do you have on scene, like infiltrators getting in the site and going haywire?
You can count them on probably one hand. Extremely rare.
Are your guards armed?
No, they are not.
So in that case, if something happened, like again, this is the very odd scenario. Let's have a tour running around this facility. We get a guard going with us, tells us where to go, and don't shoot here or don't go there.
Yes, so it most likely be the company man or a company representative would actually be a better resource. Our gate guards are positioned 100 to 300 yards in from the roadway. And that's just specifically for allowing ease of traffic because we don't want to hold traffic up on the roadway. So we have actually put their guard shacks in a little bit. So somebody would be willfully trespassing onto our lease or property to get to the guard shack.
Sound good? You guys ready to wrap it?